There are people who walk through life wearing masks so perfectly fitted that they forget their own face beneath. They smile at the right moments, speak the expected words, perform the choreography of normalcy with such precision that even they believe the performance is real. And perhaps that's the most terrifying part, not that we pretend, but that we forget we're pretending. Thomas Merton, the Trappist monk who spent decades in silence and contemplation, identified something that most psychologists overlook, something so subtle, so woven into the fabric of modern existence that we mistake it for sanity itself. He called it the false self. But it's more than just a concept in spiritual philosophy. It's the quiet death of authenticity, the slow disappearance of the person you were meant to become. You see, we're taught from childhood to adapt, to fit, to become acceptable versions of ourselves. And there's wisdom in learning social grace, in understanding context, in knowing when to speak and when to remain silent. But somewhere along the way, something shifts. The mask stops being something we wear. It becomes who we are, or rather who we think we are. Merton understood this with a clarity that cuts through centuries of psychological theory. He saw that the most dangerous psychological sign isn't anxiety, depression, or even rage. It's the complete identification with a constructed identity. It's living your entire life as someone you're not, and never once questioning whether that person is real. Think about it for a moment. How much of what you do each day is genuinely you? How many of your opinions were formed by your own contemplation, and how many were simply absorbed from your environment, your culture, your tribe? How many of your desires are truly yours, and how many were planted by advertising, social pressure, family expectations? When you speak, whose voice comes out? When you dream, whose dreams are you dreaming? These aren't comfortable questions. They shouldn't be. Because the false self thrives in comfort. It lives in the unexamined routine, in the automatic response, in the path of least resistance. It loves consensus. It fears originality. It would rather be accepted by everyone than be genuine to itself. And here's where it gets dangerous. The false self isn't some obvious villain. It doesn't feel like lying. It doesn't register as fraud. It feels normal, safe, even virtuous. Because the false self is built from pieces of what others approve. It's constructed from the expectations of parents, teachers, peers, society. It's a mosaic of other people's values, worn as if they were your own convictions. I once knew someone who spent 40 years becoming successful. They climbed every ladder, checked every box, earned every degree that society deemed important. They had the respect of colleagues, the admiration of friends, the envy of acquaintances. And one night, alone in their beautifully decorated home, they looked in the mirror and didn't recognize the person staring back. Not because they had aged, but because they realized they had become everything except themselves. Merton wrote about this with devastating precision. He said that the false self is the person we think we are supposed to be, the one who lives for the approval of others, the one who measures worth by external validation. The one who believes that identity is something to be achieved rather than discovered. And the tragedy, he observed, is that most people live and die without ever meeting their true self. They spend their entire existence being someone else. But what exactly is this false self? How does it form? And why is it so dangerous? It begins innocently enough. A child learns that certain behaviors bring praise. Smiling gets approval. Conformity brings safety. Performance earns love. And so the child begins to construct a personality designed to maximize acceptance and minimize rejection. This isn't conscious manipulation, it's survival instinct. We're social creatures, belonging matters, so we adapt. The problem arises when the adaptation becomes permanent, when the survival strategy becomes the only strategy, when the mask becomes indistinguishable from the face. The false self is built on a foundation of fear. Fear of rejection, fear of judgment, fear of being truly seen. It operates from a place of scarcity, believing that love must be earned, that acceptance must be achieved, that worth must be proven. It cannot rest. It cannot be vulnerable. It cannot afford to be real because realness might not be acceptable. And so it performs, constantly, exhaustingly, It curates every word, every gesture, every expression. It monitors social media metrics as if they measured human value. It compares endlessly, always finding itself either superior or inferior, never simply present. It achieves and achieves and achieves, believing that enough accomplishment will finally quiet the underlying terror that it might not be enough. Merton saw this playing out not just in individuals, but in entire cultures. He watched as societies manufactured identity like they manufactured products. He observed how commercial interests taught people to confuse their true needs with manufactured desires. How political systems convinced citizens that their worth was tied to their utility. How religious institutions sometimes replaced genuine spirituality with external performance. He understood that the false self is profitable. It consumes endlessly, trying to fill an internal void with external acquisitions. It competes relentlessly, believing that someone else's success diminishes its own worth. It conforms beautifully, making it easy to predict, control, and market to. But here's what makes this truly dangerous. The false self isn't just limiting, it's suffocating, it's not just uncomfortable, it's quietly devastating. Because beneath the performance, beneath the constructed identity, beneath all the accumulated achievements and carefully maintained appearances, there's a real person, a true self, and that true self is dying of neglect. Merton described this true self as the person you are in the eyes of God, not the God of judgment or fear, but the God of love, the sacred dimension of existence that sees you completely, loves you unconditionally, and has no interest in your performance. The true self is who you were before the world told you who to be. It's the original template, the authentic blueprint, the genuine article. And it's still there. Buried, perhaps. Ignored, certainly. But not dead. Not yet. You can feel it sometimes, can't you? In those rare moments when you're alone and unobserved, when there's no one to impress, no role to play, no mask to maintain. In those quiet spaces between obligations, there's a whisper, a sense of something calling from deep within, a feeling that you're meant for something more than this endless performance, that there's a life waiting to be lived that's more real than the one you're currently inhabiting. But acknowledging that whisper is terrifying. Because if the false self isn't real, then who are you? If the identity you've spent decades constructing is just a survival mechanism, then what remains? If you remove all the layers of who you think you're supposed to be, what's underneath? This is where most people stop. This is where the danger becomes most acute. Because the fear of that void, the terror of that unknown, keeps people imprisoned in the false self for their entire lives. Better to be someone, even if that someone isn't real, than to risk being no one at all. But Merton offers a different perspective. He suggests that the void isn't empty. The silence beneath the noise isn't absence. It's presence. Your presence. The most authentic version of you that's been waiting patiently for you to remember it exists. He called the process of recovering the true self contemplation. But it's not what most people think. It's not just sitting quietly or meditating, though those practices can help. It's a radical act of honesty. It's the willingness to look at yourself without the filters you've constructed. To see your motivations clearly, to acknowledge your fears honestly, to recognize where you've been performing and where you've been present. It's the courage to ask, what do I actually believe and what have I simply accepted? What do I genuinely want and what do I think I should want? Who am I when no one is watching, and who am I trying to become for an audience? These questions sound simple. They're not. Because answering them honestly requires dismantling the carefully constructed edifice of the false self. It requires admitting that some of what you've built your life around might not be true. That some of your relationships might be based on performance rather than genuine connection. That some of your achievements might have been pursued for the wrong reasons. This is why Merton called it the most dangerous psychological sign. Not because recognizing the false self is dangerous, but because living entirely within it is slowly killing you. It's dangerous because it's invisible. It's dangerous because it's normalized. It's dangerous because you can spend your entire existence in its prison and never realize you're not free. I've watched this play out in countless lives. People who achieve everything their culture defines as success, yet feel perpetually empty. People who are surrounded by admirers yet profoundly lonely. People who have built impressive careers, comfortable lives, enviable relationships, and still wake up at 3 in the morning wondering why none of it feels real. There's a particular kind of exhaustion that comes from living as the false self. It's not the healthy tiredness that comes from meaningful work or genuine engagement. It's a soul-deep fatigue that no amount of rest can cure. Because you're not just tired from doing, you're tired from pretending, from constantly monitoring yourself, from maintaining a performance that never ends. Think about how much mental energy goes into the false self. Every conversation requires calculation. What should I say to make the right impression? How should I react to seem appropriate? What expression should be on my face? What persona fits this situation? It's like playing chess while pretending you're just taking a casual walk. The cognitive load is immense, yet so normalized that most people don't even recognize it's happening. And the false self never rests. Even in private moments, it's there, narrating your life as if someone is watching, judging your thoughts, critiquing your feelings, making sure that even your internal experience conforms to some standard of acceptability. You become a stranger in your own mind, constantly editing, revising, performing, even for an audience that doesn't exist. Merton understood this exhaustion intimately. Before entering the monastery, he lived a life that looked exciting and successful from the outside. Parties, literary circles, academic achievement. But he wrote about feeling like he was slowly disappearing. Not dying in a dramatic sense, but fading, becoming less substantial, living at a distance from his own experience. He described it as a kind of unreality. The false self lives in a perpetual state of abstraction. It's always thinking about life rather than living it, always concerned with how things appear rather than how they actually are. Always worried about the future or replaying the past, never fully present because presence requires authenticity, and authenticity is what the false self most fears. The false self delivers everything except what matters most. Authenticity, presence, the sense of being genuinely alive in your own experience, rather than constantly performing someone else's script. And here's something Merton observed that's particularly relevant to our modern world. The false self thrives in an age of constant visibility. Social media, for all its connection, has become a mirror that reflects only surfaces. It rewards performance, curation, the carefully constructed image. It's the perfect environment for the false self to flourish and the true self to suffocate. Every post becomes a calculation, every photo a performance, every status update a carefully crafted piece of personal branding, and the feedback loops are immediate and addictive. Likes, comments, shares, all confirming that the false self is doing its job well, that the performance is convincing, that the mask is beautiful even as the face beneath it forgets its own features. But here's the cruel irony. The more successful the false self becomes at gaining approval, the more isolated the person feels. Because approval of a false self isn't actually approval of you, it's approval of a performance. And deep down, some part of you knows this. Knows that if people really knew you, really saw you, they might not approve at all, so the more approval you get, the more alone you feel, because you're getting praised for being someone you're not. This creates a terrible double bind. The false self is built to gain acceptance, but its very success at doing so increases the sense of isolation. You're surrounded by people who like the version of you that you present, but you can't relax into genuine connection because you'd have to drop the performance. And dropping the performance feels like risking everything. Merton saw people trapped in this bind everywhere. Priests who performed holiness, but had lost touch with genuine spirituality. Artists who created what the market demanded, but had forgotten their original vision. Activists who were so busy maintaining their image as activists that they lost connection with the cause itself. The false self can inhabit any role, even seemingly authentic ones, turning everything into performance. And the tragedy deepens when you realize that the false self doesn't just affect your relationship with others. It corrupts your relationship with yourself. You stop trusting your own feelings because you're not sure which feelings are real and which are part of the performance. You question your own desires because you don't know which ones are genuinely yours and which were implanted by expectation. You become a mystery to yourself, unable to distinguish between authentic impulse and conditioned response. This internal confusion is perhaps the false self's greatest cost. It doesn't just separate you from others, it separates you from yourself. You become a stranger living in your own skin, watching your life unfold as if it's happening to someone else, never quite certain who that someone is or why they make the choices they make. And the cruelest part, society rewards the false self. It gives it promotions, accolades, likes, followers. It makes it successful by conventional metrics. So the false self has no reason to question itself. It has proof that it's doing the right thing. It has evidence that its strategy works. Until it doesn't. Until success stops feeling like success. Until approval stops filling the void. Until achievement stops quieting the whisper that says you're living the wrong life. Merton spent years in a monastery specifically to create distance from the false self. He needed silence, solitude, space away from the constant pressure to perform, to achieve, to become. Not because he was running from the world, but because he was trying to find what was real beneath the construction. And what he discovered was both simple and profound. The true self doesn't need to be created. It needs to be uncovered. It doesn't need to be achieved. It needs to be remembered. It doesn't need to be impressive. It needs to be honest. But here's the challenging part. You can't think your way to the true self. You can't analyze it into existence. The mind, brilliant as it is the primary tool of the false self. It's what constructs the narratives, maintains the performance, defends the identity. Trying to use thought alone to get beyond the false self is like trying to use a knife to cut itself. Merton understood this. He knew that the path to the true self required something beyond intellectual understanding. It required experience, specifically the experience of simply being, without trying to become anything. The experience of presence without performance. The experience of existence without the constant need to prove, improve, or perfect. This is where contemplative practice becomes essential, not as a technique to achieve enlightenment, but as a space where the false self can finally rest, where the constant doing can pause long enough for being to emerge, where the noise of who you think you should be can quiet long enough to hear who you actually are. And what you discover in that silence might surprise you. The true self isn't some idealized version of you. It's not more spiritual, more accomplished, more anything. It's simply more real. It has flaws and limitations and all the human characteristics the false self tries to hide. But it's genuine. It's alive. It's you. Merton wrote that the true self is both hidden and obvious. Hidden because we've covered it with so many layers of construction. Obvious because it's always been there, always been present, always been the one actually living this life while the false self took credit. Think about the moments in your life when you felt most authentically yourself. Maybe it was in nature, away from social pressure. Maybe it was with someone you trusted completely, where you didn't need to perform. Maybe it was engaged in something you loved purely, without concern for recognition or reward. In those moments, the false self took a break, and what emerged was real. The question isn't whether you have a true self. You do. The question is whether you're willing to let it live, whether you're willing to risk the disapproval that might come from being genuine, whether you're willing to face the discomfort of not knowing exactly who you are without the familiar scripts and roles. Because here's what Merton knew that most people never discover. The false self promises security, but delivers imprisonment. The true self offers uncertainty, but delivers freedom. The false self seeks approval, but finds anxiety. The true self requires courage, but offers peace. This doesn't mean abandoning responsibility or social connection. It doesn't mean becoming selfish or antisocial. The true self is perfectly capable of kindness, consideration, and appropriate social behavior, but it acts from authenticity rather than performance. It gives because it wants to, not because it needs to prove its goodness. It loves because it genuinely feels love, not because it's trying to earn love in return. The shift from false self to true self is subtle but total. It's not about changing what you do as much as changing why you do it. It's not about becoming someone different, but about becoming more fully who you've always been. I've seen people make this shift, and it's remarkable to witness. They don't become more impressive, they become more present. They don't achieve more. They enjoy what they have more deeply. They don't perform better. They simply live more honestly, and somehow, paradoxically, they often become more successful in ways that actually matter to them because they're no longer pursuing goals that never belonged to them in the first place. Merton believed that this recovery of the true self wasn't just personally important, it was spiritually essential. He saw the false self as a fundamental obstacle to genuine spiritual experience. Because if you're not real, how can you encounter what's real? If you're constantly performing, how can you experience presence? If you're living someone else's life, how can you fulfill your own purpose? He wrote that every person has a unique calling, a specific way they're meant to contribute to the world. But the false self can't hear that calling. It's too busy listening to what others expect, what society values, what culture demands. The true self in its quiet authenticity is the only one capable of recognizing and responding to that deeper invitation. This is why he considered the false self not just psychologically dangerous, but spiritually devastating. It doesn't just make you unhappy, it prevents you from becoming who you were meant to be. It doesn't just cause suffering, it causes you to miss your own life. And the tragedy is that this happens unconsciously. Most people don't deliberately choose the false self. They slide into it gradually, one small compromise at a time. One moment of choosing approval over authenticity. One instance of saying what's expected instead of what's true. One decision to pursue someone else's definition of success rather than discovering their own. None of these moments feels significant in isolation, but accumulated over years, over decades, they build a prison so familiar that it feels like home. A life so scripted that spontaneity feels dangerous. An identity so constructed that authenticity feels impossible. But Merton offers hope. He insists that it's never too late, that the true self is always there, always waiting, always ready to emerge the moment we create space for it. That no matter how deeply buried, how long ignored, how thoroughly forgotten, your authentic self remains intact. The work isn't to create something new, it's to remove what's false. It's to identify the masks and gently set them aside. It's to recognize the performances and give yourself permission to stop. It's to notice where you're living for others and choose to live for what's true. This takes tremendous courage, more courage than maintaining the false self ever required, because the false self, for all its anxiety and exhaustion, is familiar. It's known. It has strategies for every situation, responses for every challenge. Letting it go means entering unknown territory. It means not knowing exactly who you'll be without all those carefully constructed protections. But this is where real life begins. In that uncertainty, in that openness, in that willingness to be vulnerable, to be seen, to be real. The false self offers the illusion of control at the cost of aliveness. The true self offers the uncertainty of authenticity in exchange for the experience of being genuinely present in your own existence. Merton lived this truth. He gave up a promising literary career, walked away from a life that looked successful by every conventional measure, and entered a monastery where he had to confront himself without distraction. And what he found there transformed not just his life, but the lives of millions who read his words and recognize their own struggle in his journey. He wrote that the beginning of love is to let those we love be perfectly themselves and not to twist them to fit our own image. But he understood that this begins with ourselves. We have to let ourselves be perfectly ourselves. We have to stop twisting our own nature to fit some imposed or imagined ideal. We have to give ourselves the same compassion, the same acceptance, the same permission to be real that we hope to offer others. This is the antidote to the most dangerous psychological sign. Not more achievement, not better performance, not a more impressive mask, but the courage to remove the mask entirely. To stand in your own presence without apology, to live from your center rather than your circumference, to be authentic even when authenticity isn't impressive. And here's what you discover when you do this. The world doesn't end. Relationships don't all collapse. Life doesn't fall apart. Sometimes certain things do shift. Relationships based purely on performance may fade. Pursuits that were never truly yours may lose their appeal. But what remains, what grows in that space, is infinitely more valuable. Connection that's based on truth. Work that actually matters to you. A life that feels like yours. The true self isn't dramatic. It doesn't announce itself with fanfare. It emerges quietly, like dawn. At first, just a subtle lightening at the horizon, then slowly, gradually, the full illumination of who you actually are. Not who you wish you were, not who others need you to be, but who you've always been beneath all the construction. Merton described this emergence as a kind of resurrection. The true self that was buried under the false self begins to live again. And with that resurrection comes something unexpected, joy. Not the joy of achievement or approval, but the joy of simply being real, of living in alignment with your actual nature, of experiencing life directly rather than through the filter of performance. This joy isn't constant. Life remains complex, challenging, sometimes painful, but there's a quality to the experience that's different, more vivid, more present, more yours, because you're actually living it rather than performing it. You're actually feeling it rather than managing how you appear to feel. People notice this shift, though they might not be able to name it. There's something more genuine about your presence. Less performance, more substance. Less trying to impress, more simply being impressive by virtue of being real. Less anxiety about perception, more ease in your own skin. And paradoxically, this often makes you more effective in the world, not less. Because you're no longer wasting energy maintaining a false front. You're no longer divided between who you are and who you're pretending to be. You become more integrated, more whole, more capable of bringing your full self to whatever you do. Merton understood that this journey from false self to true self isn't a one-time transition. It's an ongoing practice. The false self doesn't disappear permanently after one moment of recognition. It has deep roots, strong habits, familiar patterns. It will try to reassert itself, especially under stress or in situations that trigger old fears. But once you've tasted the freedom of authenticity, once you've experienced the peace of being genuinely yourself, the false self loses its power. You can recognize it when it appears. You can see it trying to take control, and you can make a different choice, not perfectly, not always, but increasingly, consistently, more often than not. This is the real work of psychological and spiritual maturity. Not achieving some idealized state of perpetual authenticity, but developing the awareness to recognize when you're being real and when you're performing. And then, with compassion for yourself, choosing reality more often. Merton's warning about the false self isn't meant to create more anxiety or self-judgment. It's meant to wake you up, to invite you to look honestly at how you're living, to ask whether the life you're currently inhabiting is actually yours, or whether you've been living according to someone else's blueprint. And if you discover that you've been living largely from the false self, that recognition itself is the beginning of change, not self-criticism, just awareness. Gentle, honest awareness that sees clearly and chooses differently going forward. The most dangerous psychological sign, according to Thomas Merton, isn't that we create false selves. It's that we forget they're false. It's that we live and die having never met our true self, having never discovered what we're actually capable of being, feeling, experiencing, becoming. But you're reading this now, and that means something. It means some part of you, probably your true self, is tired of the performance, is ready for something more real, is willing to begin the journey from construction to authenticity, from performance to presence, from who you think you should be to who you actually are. That journey doesn't require perfection. It requires honesty. It doesn't require dramatic change all at once. It requires small, consistent choices toward authenticity. It doesn't require abandoning everything you've built. It requires examining what you've built and keeping what's true while releasing what's false. And perhaps most importantly, it requires patience and compassion with yourself. The false self developed as a survival mechanism. It was trying to protect you, to help you belong, to keep you safe. It wasn't your enemy, even if it became your prison, So this isn't about violently destroying the false self. It's about gently, consistently, choosing to live from somewhere deeper and truer. In the end, what Merton offers isn't just a warning, it's an invitation. An invitation to the most important relationship of your life, the relationship with your true self, the one who's been waiting patiently beneath all the performance, all the achievement, all the carefully constructed identity. The one who knows who you really are, what you really want, what you're really here to do. That's the person worth meeting. That's the life worth living, not the impressive one. Not the one that looks good from the outside, but the one that feels true from the inside, the one that's actually authentically, undeniably yours. But let's be honest about what this journey actually involves, because the path from false self to true self isn't a gentle, pleasant transition. It's more like a death and rebirth. The false self will fight to survive. It has to. It's been your primary survival mechanism, perhaps for decades. And survival mechanisms don't surrender easily. When you begin to question the false self, when you start to peel away the layers of performance and conditioning, you'll encounter resistance. Not just from the world, though that will come, but from within yourself, from the parts of you that are terrified of what might happen if you stop performing, if you stop achieving, if you stop being who everyone expects you to be. This internal resistance manifests in many ways, sometimes as anxiety, sometimes as depression, sometimes as a sudden overwhelming urge to distract yourself, to stay busy, to do anything except sit with the uncomfortable truth that you've been living someone else's life. The false self will generate 1,000 reasons why now isn't the right time, why you should wait, why questioning your identity is dangerous or selfish or impractical. And in a sense, the false self is right. There is danger in this journey, not the kind it imagines, but real danger nonetheless. The danger of losing relationships that were based solely on your performance. The danger of having to abandon pursuits that never truly mattered to you. The danger of discovering that much of what you've built was built on a foundation of sand. Merton didn't sugarcoat this. He knew that awakening to the false self and choosing to live from the true self would cost something. He gave up a literary career that was just beginning to flourish. He walked away from relationships, from opportunities, from a whole way of life that looked successful, by every conventional measure. And he did this not because he was running away, but because he was running towards something more real. There's a phase in this journey that spiritual traditions sometimes call the dark night. It's when you've begun to see through the false self, but haven't yet fully connected with the true self. You're suspended between two identities, belonging fully to neither. The old self no longer fits, but the new self hasn't fully emerged. It's disorienting, sometimes terrifying, and absolutely necessary, because in that darkness, in that void between who you were pretending to be and who you actually are, something essential happens. You learn to tolerate uncertainty, to exist without the constant need to know exactly who you are and where you're going. To be okay with not having all the answers, not having your identity clearly defined, not fitting neatly into any category. This tolerance for uncertainty is crucial, because the true self isn't a fixed thing that you discover once and possess forever. It's more like a living presence that emerges moment by moment when you're willing to be real. It's not an achievement to be attained, but an ongoing practice of authenticity. Merton wrote extensively about this process. He called it contemplation, but he meant something very specific. Not just meditation or prayer, though those can be part of it. He meant the willingness to sit in your own presence without distraction, without performance, without the constant need to be doing or becoming something. Just being, simply, honestly, vulnerably being. And in that being, something remarkable happens. You start to notice things, the way thoughts arise without your choosing them, the way emotions move through you like weather patterns, the way your body has its own intelligence, its own rhythms, its own truth. You begin to recognize that you are not your thoughts, not your emotions, not even your body. You are the awareness that contains all of these things. This recognition is liberating, because if you're not your thoughts, then you don't have to believe every thought that arises. If you're not your emotions, then you don't have to be controlled by every feeling. If you're not your body, then your worth isn't determined by your appearance or your physical capabilities. You are something more fundamental, something that exists before all the construction, all the performance, all the false self. Merton called this the true self. Others have called it the soul, the spirit, the essence, consciousness itself. The name matters less than the recognition. The recognition that beneath all the layers of conditioning and performance and adaptation, there is something authentic, something that has always been there, something that is, in fact, you. And here's what's both beautiful and challenging about this recognition. Once you've seen it, you can't unsee it. Once you've tasted the freedom of being genuinely yourself, the prison of the false self becomes unbearable. You might still slip back into performance, still catch yourself pretending, still find yourself living according to others' expectations. But now you know. And knowing changes everything. The journey from false self to true self isn't about becoming someone different. It's about becoming more fully who you already are. It's about stripping away what's false rather than adding something new. It's about remembering rather than achieving. And this makes it both harder and easier than you might think. Harder because you can't just learn a new skill or adopt a new technique. You have to be willing to question everything you've built your identity around, to examine your motivations honestly, to see where you've been living for others and choose to live for truth instead. This takes courage that most people never mobilize. But easier, because you don't have to create something from nothing. The true self is already there. It's been there all along, waiting patiently beneath the performance. You don't have to become worthy of it or earn the right to be yourself. You just have to stop preventing it from emerging. You just have to get out of your own way. And the beautiful thing about this journey? You don't have to travel anywhere to find your true self. You don't have to achieve anything more or become someone different. You just have to stop pretending to be who you're not. You just have to remember who you've been all along. You just have to let yourself be real. That's the wisdom Thomas Merton offers across decades, across the monastery walls where he discovered it, across the silence where he learned to listen. The most dangerous thing isn't the challenges outside you, it's the stranger you've become to yourself, the life you're living that isn't yours, the person you're pretending to be while your true self waits, patient and eternal, for you to finally come home.